Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this Republican shutdown is an outrageous abdication of Congress's responsibility, and it didn't need to be this way. In fact, if the House leadership were to call up a clean, continuing resolution appropriations bill today, it would pass. There are a sufficient number of votes from both sides of the political aisle to pass the measure. So far, however, the House Republican leadership has refused to do so, afraid of extremists within its own caucus, the so-called Ted Cruz Tea Party faction, whose demand is to shut down the government until the Affordable Care Act is either repealed or delayed. And so the American people's government has shut down. 90% of the employees of the Environmental Protection Agency have been furloughed. 84% of the employees of the Department of Interior, all over the country, but mostly in the western states, have all been furloughed. 70% of the employees of our essential intelligence agencies have now been furloughed. Recipients of the Women and Infant Care Program, the most vulnerable mothers and children, have had their livelihoods jeopardized. The National Institutes of Health have had to turn away 30 children with cancer from clinical trials. We in this House must end this shutdown. This debate isn't even about the budget. The President and the Senate have already agreed to trillions of dollars of cuts set by the so-called Ryan Republican budget. Even though this draconian budget will endanger basic government operations, it'll disinvest in our children's future, and it'll trigger even more federal employee furloughs and possible rifts. Rather, this shutdown is about a measure that strengthens insurance coverage for the roughly 260 million Americans who have insurance. It will also eliminate pre-existing conditions and lifetime limits and makes health insurance available and affordable to roughly 40 million uninsured Americans through state exchanges where insurance companies compete to provide coverage, and through expansion of the Medicaid program. The Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. It has been affirmed as constitutional by the Republican-dominated Supreme Court and by a 5 million vote majority of the American people, with the defeat of the presidential candidate who promised to repeal it less than a year ago. Regardless of where one may stand on the issue of the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, our democratic process for enacting laws and setting policy should not be held hostage to the threat of a government shutdown. It sets a terrible precedent for the future. My Republican colleagues continue to demand concessions with serious long-term consequences in exchange for funding a spending bill for just a relatively few more days, another 45 days or so. They want long-term concessions at their preferred inadequate spending levels. What unreasonable demands will be made when this latest CR expires in 2 months or 1 month? These attempts to overturn the Democratic results of the last election by threat-making and hostage-taking must end now. We should do our job, fund the government, and we should remove the looming threat to the global economy in the form of the expiration of the debt ceiling, which will occur just in a couple of weeks. Not content with the economic destruction and hardship wrought by their government shutdown and their refusal to let the federal government play its historic role to stimulate a strong economic recovery, House Republicans continue to threaten the full faith and credit of the United States. As President Obama noted, if the tables were turned and you had a Republican president and a Democratic speaker, as you did during the Reagan administration, neither Speaker O'Neill nor the American people would tolerate what is going on today. And in fact, that's the situation that we have today, a broken Congress, a situation where the American people's voice isn't heard or represented. It's time for us to heed the American people, to let the majority of this Congress determine public policy. Let's stop the extremism. Let's be responsible.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Let's pass this continuing resolution clean. Get on with the business of the government. Thank